to everybody. And thank you for being flexible and finding us and tracking us down tonight due to IT difficulties and challenges. We had to change the platform from Teams to Zoom. And so thank you for locating our link and joining us tonight. This is, of course, another in our series of the College of Charleston's School of Languages, Cultures, and World Affairs Colloquium. Tonight, we're featuring the distinguished General Ben Hodges. My name is Tim Johnson, and I'm Dean of the school. Whether this is a return visit to the series or you are joining us for the first time, we are grateful to have you here and participating, and I'm sure it'll be a worthwhile discussion tonight. As part of the presentation tonight, General Hodges has agreed to take questions. And feel free to enter your questions into the chat. And we have moderators tonight that will check the chat space and pose those questions. As appropriate, you may also just speak out your question. There's no problem with that approach either. So we should have a good discussion tonight. Now, before our ambassador, Jim Melville, introduces our speaker, I am pleased to make a general announcement tonight that you may have already guessed what's coming from the new title for the series. On the announcement that went out, it was under the title, the Mroz Institute World Affairs Colloquium. Last month, the College of Charleston and LCWA formalized a partnership with the East-West Institute, a highly successful NGO for over 40 years. This partnership will develop as part of our programming the John Edwin Mroz Global Leadership Institute at the college. We are grateful for the financial support EWI and their longtime friends, such as Marshall and Arlene Bennett, have provided for us. John Edwin Mroz was the founder, CEO, and president of EWI. He was a fiercely independent champion of conflict prevention and resolution, serving as a primary liaison in the Middle East, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and US-Soviet relations. So I'm going to take a moment tonight to introduce you to Max Kovalov, faculty member from the college who will be the Bennett director. And Max will say a few words about the Institute's mission and vision, and then he will hand it over to Ambassador Melville for introductions. Max?
Thank you, Dean. Dean Johnson. My name is Max Kovalov. I'm the director of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute. Welcome to the World Affairs Colloquium series. As Dean Johnson already said, the John Edwin Mroz Global Leadership Institute is a collaborative partnership between the School of Languages, Cultures, and World Affairs and the East-West Institute. The mission of the Mroz Institute is to promote essential skills of global fluency and diplomacy, and to continue the legacy of the East-West Institute and its founder, John Edwin Mroz. We work to prepare students to become future global leaders through experiential learning opportunities, international mentoring programs, study abroad experiences, and professional development programs. And this colloquium series is an important part of the Mroz Institute programming, designed to bring to campus prominent speakers with international experience to stimulate discussions with our students, faculty, and the community. So thank you for joining us tonight. And I will now turn the program over to Ambassador Jim Melville to introduce tonight's guest.
Thank you, Max. In my humble opinion, the Transatlantic Alliance is the crown jewel of all of our foreign policy achievements since the end of World War II. And our guest tonight is one of its great heroes. Retired General Ben Hodges is the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Frankfurt, Germany. but he spent nearly 40 years in the U.S. Army from the time he entered as a young kid from Florida into West Point. Ben's last job was as the commanding general of European forces or American forces in Europe. And in 2014, he took that command. I was serving then as deputy chief of mission in Germany, and that's where we first met. And we continued our association throughout the time that I was in the Foreign Service, and even into retirement here. So Ben is a great speaker. I've seen him on many occasions, and it would be my pleasure, Ben, to welcome you to Charleston in person the next time you're on this side of the pond. So we really, as Tim said, we really appreciate that you're up in the middle of the night there to keep us company and tell us all about why we should care about the Transatlantic Alliance, Europe, NATO, and the Biden administration, which is actually the title of your talk. So as the Germans say, the floor is yours.
Ambassador, Dean, all of you, thanks very much for the privilege. You know, I'm a native Floridian, but I have shifted my U.S. base to Beaufort, South Carolina. My oldest best friend in the world, we were cadets together way back in 1976, lives in Beaufort. He's a retired Army officer and colonel, served special forces his whole life, and Beaufort has been my safe haven for the last 10 years. And so now most of my earthly possessions that are not here with us in Frankfurt are sitting in his house in Beaufort. And I love going there. It's become my pied à terre for the States. And so I'm envious of all of y'all where you are there in the Carolina Low Country. I think what Jim and I agreed to kind of do here is to have a conversation this evening and to kind of go back and forth on some of the topics that he and I both enjoyed working together over the past several years. But let me just put this out front. There's no doubt the Biden administration has made it clear, the Trump administration made it clear, and the Obama administration made it clear that China is the long-term strategic threat, the competitor in all different domains. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean we turn away from Europe. The European Union is our largest economic trading partner, and they will remain that for many, many years to come. And then they'll be number two, and they'll still be a huge part. And our economic prosperity is based in large part on economic prosperity as well as stability and security in Europe. Secondly, even with the biggest defense budget in history, the United States military does not have the capacity to do everything that our nation needs in terms of our great Navy, or Air Force, land forces, intelligence, you name it. We are always going to need allies. We cannot do anything by ourselves that's large or sustained. We're going to have allies. And all of our best and most reliable allies come from Europe, as well as Canada and Australia. So for those reasons, it's an easy answer to me of why does Europe matter? Are there frustrations? Absolutely. Have we got to address defense investments by European allies? Of course. Do we need to figure out a way to coexist with the Kremlin, with Russia, and with China, led by the Chinese Communist Party? Yes. But we're going to be most effective by working with our European allies. And so that's kind of my mindset as we start this conversation. And I do look forward to questions from all of you here as we go along. I would want this to be worthwhile and worth your time if you chose to tune in this evening. So, Ambassador Jim, I look forward to it. had a generally agreed upon strategy. That didn't mean it was without arguments. You remember the issues when during the Reagan administration, the decision to deploy Pershing II, for example, to counter a Soviet threat. I was here in Germany as a very young officer, and there were huge demonstrations across Germany. But having said that, American policy towards Europe has been fairly consistent, and that NATO has been an essential part of that, a pillar, if you will. What was different, and by the way, every president since Truman has complained that European allies didn't do enough. Republicans, Democrats, it didn't matter. But even though they didn't do enough, it still was to our advantage, the United States, to be able to have troops based in Europe, Air Force here, the Navy in Europe, for our benefit, to project power into Eurasia, the Middle East, Africa, with Europe as kind of a forward base. You can't do everything from Shaw Air Force Base, or from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, or from Norfolk Naval Air Station, or from Norfolk Navy Base. You have to be forward deployed and have a presence, even though the presence today is 10% of what it was when I was a lieutenant 100 years ago. The difference is that never in my life did a president question America's commitment to Article 5, the NATO alliance, the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which created NATO back in 1949, where we said that an armed attack on one shall be considered an attack on all. And in the previous administration, the president called that into question. He said, I'm not so sure that we would really want to get into a fight over Montenegro. And that was a significant shock to the system. And then what makes NATO, what makes it the most successful alliance in the history of the world is the fact that the cohesion was always there. There was never a question that whether it was Estonia or Luxembourg or Poland or Germany, whoever was attacked, or the United States, that the rest were all going to be there. And by the way, Article 5 has only been invoked one time in the, don't do math in public, 51, 72 years of the alliance. And that was after 9/11 when the United States was attacked, and the rest of NATO agreed, considered that as an attack on themselves. So the Kremlin looks over and they do not want to get into a conflict with 30 nations. And so the cohesion of the alliance is really what is our guarantee for deterrence. That was less certain during the last 4 years. It remains to be seen with the new administration if the actions back up the words. But certainly it was important that President Biden, in his first week, one of his first calls was to Secretary General Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, to assure him that the United States was committed to NATO. Secretary of Defense Austin, his first morning in the Pentagon was to a call to Secretary General Stoltenberg to say, the United States is committed to NATO. So hopefully that removes any doubt or uncertainty about that. But you can be sure that the administration is going to still put pressure on allies to do more.
I'm sure that's true. But do you think, I mean, to me, it seems that it would be an illusion to ignore the troubles of the last 4 years and just take it for granted that there's a place of leadership at the head of the table that says the United States of America, and we can just march back in and take command and everybody is going to follow us. Because I think one of the takeaways from the last administration is that the word of the United States is not what it used to be. I mean, we backed out of so many commitments, and whether you're talking about on global challenges like climate, or the questions that were thrown into the transatlantic relation and NATO, or the JCPOA, it seems to me we have to win our place back and maybe be a little bit more humble and modest about our role. What do you think of that?
Well, a relationship takes two. And so our allies have a responsibility. They have benefited, particularly Western Europe, particularly Germany, has benefited more than anybody from the last 7 decades of this sort of global order that was engineered by the United States at the end of the Second World War, and Germany has benefited from that for the first time in their history, in the history of Germany. Now, of course, Germany, as we know it today, didn't come into being until the 19th century. Before that, there were 400 something different small states, and Bavaria and Prussia, of course, were the two largest. But Germany became a country of Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. And then, of course, reunification took place about 31, 32 years ago. But for the first time in history, Germany has only friends all around it. I mean, Poland, France, the Netherlands, friendly countries all around it. First time in history. And so there's no incentive, candidly, for many Germans and German politicians to advocate for defense spending. Instead, they're kind of basking in the protection provided by the alliance. The front line is moved from when Germany was divided. The front line now is literally 1,000 kilometers to the east on the other side of Poland. So the Trump administration took really dramatic steps to try and address that. I mean, even President Obama, who had like a 90% favorability rating in Germany, had called the Germans free riders, but nothing really, they never did anything about it. President Trump's approach was, unfortunately, with Germany, it had the opposite effect of what was intended. The Germans dug in because they didn't like his approach to it, and I think that the damage to the cohesion of the alliance was pretty severe. And so your point that our Europeans lost confidence in the United States, that there is an expectation, not just for defense, but an expectation of American leadership in the world. Everybody knows that all of these international organizations are flawed. I mean, that's the nature of treaties. That's the nature of coalitions. That's the nature of international organizations, is that in order to get everybody to come together, people are having to give up
Compromise.
And
yeah.
So I personally believe that we should lead, not leave. You can't fix any organization. You can't fix any treaty. You can't fix anything if you walk away from it. And that vacuum has been getting filled by the Chinese, or the Kremlin went ahead and did what they wanted. Where I believe we should have approached these things is with the Germans in particular, but also with the French and the British, work closely together to put pressure on these institutions. And we haven't done that over the years. That was not a Trump thing. That goes back multiple administrations.
Right. And I do remember the efforts in the Obama administration and Wales in particular, to squeeze the Germans to live up to their commitment to burden sharing. But if you've mentioned Russia a couple of times, and obviously or the Soviet Union, and that's one of the main reasons NATO came into existence. But last week, the European Union foreign minister was in Moscow, and he got beaten up pretty badly by Lavrov. And it was a reminder, and perhaps even a chance for the European Union and our NATO allies in the EU to kind of realize that maybe a tougher line with the Russians is the only way to put our interests first. And what I'm really wondering about is the Germans and their commitment to Nord Stream 2 as an example of how they seem to put their economic prosperity in a kind of selfish way when you look at the overall alliance interests ahead of solidarity. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
So I'm not a Russia expert, but in all my study, I have never seen anything that would change my mind about this, that the Kremlin only respects strength and they despise weakness. I mean, that goes back to Peter the Great, Catherine, all the way up through President Putin. The fact that Foreign Minister Lavrov just humiliated Mr. Borrell last week was an example of that, of the way they despise, they have no fear of the EU, and they kicked out diplomats from Germany, Poland, and Sweden, I think, like the day that Borrell arrived. I mean, that's pretty direct. And then Mr. Borrell, of course, everybody or many people advised him not to go because of the Navalny imprisonment sentencing that had just happened before, but he decided that he could go. And so it was another example of sort of a hubris that some people have, that some American presidents have had. I mean, you all remember President Bush talking about, I looked into Putin's eyes, I could see his soul. The Obama administration, we're going to reset, Secretary Clinton, we're going to reset.
Yep.
All of that is ridiculous. That's not, and we continue to allow ourselves to be embarrassed and humiliated and surprised. The fact that the Kremlin felt that they could invade Ukraine in 2014. I mean, the day after the Winter Olympics in Sochi. So they spend billions of rubles to host look how wonderful Russia is, Winter Olympics. And then the next day or the next week, they invade Ukraine because they knew that we, the collective we, were going to do nothing. And part of that, I think, came from, you remember President Obama's red line in Syria. If you guys use chemical weapons, all right, that's it. And zip, nothing. We didn't do anything. The Brits didn't do anything. The French didn't do anything. The Germans didn't do anything. And so, of course, Assad was only still in power because of support from the Kremlin. And the result of Assad using chemical weapons on his own people, enabled by the Kremlin, put about 4 million refugees on the road into Turkey and into Southeastern Europe. That was not an accident. That was intentional collateral outcome, what former SACEUR General Breedlove called the weaponization of migrants. This was all intended to destabilize Europe. And so when I think President Putin saw that we weren't going to do anything about that, then I think he felt pretty confident he could put helicopters into Crimea and then also invade Eastern Ukraine in the Donbass and not really worry about it. And he was exactly right. I mean, other than the United States eventually providing training and some equipment, but I mean, we were not even reluctant during the Obama administration. We were not even willing to provide lethal aid, javelin, for example. And
well, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that we didn't think the Ukrainians were ready for that kind of commitment. And the Ukrainians themselves have made a lot of progress since the Russians invaded in 2014. And I do remember that with enhanced forward presence, NATO itself took quite a few steps to make it clear that the Russians had provoked more than just a passing response, and it was difficult. What we did manage to organize in response to the events in Ukraine was better than a lot of people thought we could have done. Yeah. But you're right. It was far from ideal, and it still is. So the Ukrainians are much better at defending their own interests, as you were pointing out. The alliance is I think, reminded of its purpose. Certainly, sitting in Estonia, they didn't need to be reminded. I can testify to that. But what what should we do about it now?
Well, I believe that great power competition prevents great power conflict. And the competition is only a little bit military, but actually most of the competition should come in the diplomacy and information and economy. You know, what we grow up using, I say we, in the military, when you go to war college or staff college, we learn this construct called the DIME construct, DIME, diplomacy, information, military, and economy. And those are, it's simplistic, which is ideal for me, but it's, think of the four broad categories or domains of national power: diplomacy, information, military, and economy. And everybody in the military prefers, of course, that the M be small, lowercase, and that we emphasize, we lead with diplomatic efforts, we lead by competing in the information space, and we lead by economic investment and encouraging private investment. And all of that's backed up by military cooperation or military presence. And so I think this is the way we want to, how we've got to operate. You have to have trained, ready forces, allies, but really working with our German allies. And I think Germany, despite all the things that they should be doing more, this is our most important ally. That doesn't mean they're our favorite country or that we never have huge arguments, but from the standpoint of their geography, their economic power, their leadership inside the European Union, and frankly, a level of moral authority that they have earned over the last 7 decades through their atonement. This is who we should be working with. I think Germany is the only country diplomatically and economically that can really influence Kremlin behavior. And I think they can influence behavior of the Chinese Communist Party because of their economic power, because they bring with them the whole European Union. That's substantial power. And so I think the Biden administration is going to look for ways with working with the European Union to compete against the Chinese and compete against the Kremlin in those diplomatic, information, and economic spheres.
I agree with you completely about Germany and its role so far and its potential to do more, and for us to do more together. When you mention China, it seems to me that China isn't just our big competitor. You know, long term, it's going to be Russia's problem, probably even more so than those of us in the West. So my hope eventually is that Russia will wake up to that, and that itself might force them to change a little bit in terms of how they relate to the West.
Well, look, I try to distinguish between China and the Chinese Communist Party because just like with Russia, I try to focus on the Kremlin. I mean, nobody suffered more under the Kremlin than actual Russian people have. So when we talk about the Chinese Communist Party, they own everything. Their industry, businesses are all may not be owned, but obviously they're controlled. And so when the president of Huawei says, "Oh, I don't have to report anything to the government," that's absolute, totally false, completely false. So what do we do about this? 1.4 billion people. That's a gigantic market that we all want a piece of. The United States wants that. Everybody tuned in this evening owns things that are manufactured in China. So we all want a piece of that market, just like they want to dominate our markets. So we've got to figure out a way to ensure, to stop the theft of technology, to press the Chinese to trade in accordance with international law and fair and open competition. And the only way that's going to happen, The only way that's going to happen is if the United States works with the European Union and India and allies in the Pacific and the UK in that diplomatic sphere that I talked about and in the economic sphere, and that we put pressure on them. Otherwise, they can pick and choose and separate us. And if they get Germany to buy Huawei, for example, for their network, which, you know, and that's still a possibility. I mean, that's a major crack. That's going to cause a real problem for us. But what are we doing to compete, to come up with other alternatives versus just telling the Germans, you can't do that? I mean, there's got to be a way that we can work with Nokia and Ericsson, for example, to develop networks in Europe that are not reliant on Chinese technology, and where you're guaranteed they're going to be inside every network we have. Same thing with, I mean, the China. Let me say it this way. Obviously, I hope I am completely wrong, and we've got to do everything we can to prevent it from happening. But I am very concerned that in about the next 5 years, we could be in a kinetic conflict with China. I'm talking about ships, planes, missiles. And the reason I think that that's a possibility, not a probability, but a possibility, is they see that we are not fully united. I mean, the EU, just before President Biden takes office, rushes under German leadership to establish a trade agreement. Now, there's still some gates to go through, but the fact that they did that, got that done just before the Biden administration takes over, after the incoming administration has said, hey, look, we want to work closely with the EU. Why would they do that? And so the Chinese see that. Now, they also see that we, the West, really didn't do anything about Hong Kong. I mean, there were protests and all that, and
the British have opened their borders to.
Even the UK did not really do anything.
Yeah.
I mean, not in a meaningful way. Economic pressure, I mean, nothing. And so they see that, and the language as well as the actions oriented towards Taiwan is very concerning. And I think they're going to test the administration very soon. And then, of course, the well-known issues around the South China Sea, freedom claims to territorial waters. All of these things have the potential to lead to a possible conflict. And when I said earlier that great power competition prevents great power conflict, by that I mean if we're competing in diplomacy, information, and economy with allies, we're conveying that, hey, this is a priority for us. Now, you can't have 1 million Uyghurs locked up in a concentration camp doing slave labor. We're not going to buy any product from you that they make. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we've got to do.
That's hard for us because I think in the West, we're certainly speaking as an American, our Achilles heel has been our greed. It's money before many, many other things. And to put economic prosperity at risk for 1 million Uyghurs or anything else is a hard sell to some elements here. But
well, sure. I mean, every administration has a responsibility and has committed to raising prosperity, quality of life, plus all the other things that you want to do to ensure
right.
good education, healthcare, infrastructure, and so on. But the Biden administration has also made a commitment towards human rights, those kinds of issues as well. And Secretary of State Blinken, I think, has a reputation for that. President Biden has talked about a summit of democracies.
Yeah.
This is a part of that competition too. We have such a better story to tell.
Absolutely.
We have to live it. We have to live up to our own talking points.
yeah, we have to keep in mind that that is our best product, and we should put it first. And I think that's been such an important part of our public diplomacy for so long that it's a sort of you feel it in your bones. But I wanted to turn to another area that has caused a lot of concerns to the southeast from where you're sitting in Iran and the problems in the Middle East. And do you see any, besides the discussion about going back into the JCPOA and lifting sanctions against the Iranians that they want, do you see an opportunity for improvement in our position vis-a-vis those concerns?
Hey, Jim, if you don't mind, before we leave China, I see Michael Gomez asked a question.
Go for it.
A commercial partner is far preferable to a sparring partner. Michael, is that correct? Did I get it right? Okay. I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, a commercial partner, if that commercial partner depends on slave labor, stolen technology, and unfair trading practices where American businesses cannot compete, and the other side has all the advantages, and that ends up hurting American business, I don't know that that's preferable. That doesn't mean that the only other choice is a kinetic conflict, but just to have the business, I don't think that that's the direction that we would want to take. But I do take your point. You know, the last thing I'd want to see us do is get into a kinetic conflict with the Chinese, and it's not inevitable. I'm sorry, Jim. So Iran.
Right. Another threat.
If I may butt in and introduce a couple questions in the chat, we'll get to Iran because that's a great question. But also on while we're on Russia and China, there's a question in the chat about the pipeline. What do you think about the security implications of the pipeline from Russia to Germany?
Yeah.
And
so this is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that's probably about 94% complete. But in a very, very strong bipartisan effort, the United States has put sanctions on anybody and everybody that is in any way associated with the construction of this pipeline. Most members of the European Union also oppose it, but Germany continues to march ahead with it. And it really is it's difficult for me to get my head around it. But even Chancellor Merkel, she has said, hey, that's business. That has nothing to do with politics. But that's that also rings pretty hollow because Russia uses energy as one of its tools for politics, for leverage, whether it's electrical power, and they can dial it up and down, the gas and electricity for Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All those countries are still on the grid and get the majority of their power from Russia. You know, we're all trying to get them off of it, but they're still there. And so this pipeline has 2 or 3 significant implications. Number one, it bypasses Ukraine. And Ukraine currently gets around $2 billion a year of transit fees for Russian gas that goes to Europe. And most of Europe gets their gas, a large part of it, I should say, from either Russia or from the Caspian region. The United States is starting to compete here, but LNG is still more expensive than the Russian gas. So we've got to be able to compete as part of this. But the fact is, Ukraine will be a victim of Nord Stream 2 because then the Russians would no longer have to ship through there, and that's a lot of income for Ukraine that would be lost. Secondly, it increases, I believe, the dependence of Europe on Russian gas. instead of Europe diversifying and looking for other sources, now they have completely given themselves over, the Germans have, to Russian gas. And third, the money, the hundreds of millions of euro that are going back to the Kremlin because of this gas. I mean, you can sort of see the bitter irony of this. We're pounding the Germans to spend more on defense to help protect against the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the Germans are sending money to the Kremlin for the gas. And so it doesn't make sense. Now, Germany is not alone in that economic interests drive foreign policy. That's exactly what drives American foreign policy. It's what drives British foreign policy. It's what drives everybody's foreign policy is strategic interest, economic interest. But this one is particularly hard to, it's a vulnerability for us, and the Russians are exploiting it. Did we lose Dean Johnson?
I'm not sure, but do you want to talk about Iran for a sec?
Well, okay. So the JCPOA was the agreement that was signed between Iran, the United States, Germany, China, and Russia had a hand in it. And like I said earlier, like any deal, there's going to be flaws in it. And I just believed it was a mistake to walk away from it rather than continuing to work with a couple of our allies to hold Iran accountable. And yes, it didn't answer all the challenges, but I think it bought us some time. And frankly, most countries in the world, particularly in Europe, don't have the benefit that the United States has of incredible geography, seemingly unlimited resources, and less other countries in Europe are so dependent on international agreements and organizations, and so their default setting is to those kind of things. And so when the United States says, "Screw it, we're walking away," it leaves them exposed, and it undermines their trust and confidence in American leadership. So I wish that we had never walked away from the JCPOA, and I think, and I could be challenged on this, but when we talk about Iran, the image we have is the U.S. Embassy being attacked, American diplomats being blindfolded and held hostage for over a year, and the Ayatollah. That's the image. And of course, there's no doubt in my mind. We all know that Iran was supporting terrorists that were killing American
Hezbollah,
soldiers, that were killing American soldiers in Iraq, as well as supporting attacks on Israel. We know that. But behind all that is Persia. I mean, one of the great countries in the history of the world, one of the great people in the history of the world. And I just believe that that we've got to figure out a way how to separate the regime from the people, and figure out a way to support. I'm not into regime change, forcing it, but supporting civil society in ways, and because they're the ones that pay the price on sanctions anyway. It's the Ayatollah is not suffering, or the guy General Soleimani that we killed about a year ago, deservedly so. He was one of the richest people in Iran, but the sanctions, hurt the population.
Yeah. So there was a good question in the chat that has nothing to do with Iran, but the Arctic and the future competition that seems to be lining up for resources in the Arctic between Russia, the West, even the Chinese. And what are your thoughts about that as an evolving area of concern or opportunity?
Well, there's always opportunity where there's challenge. Uh, you can argue about what causes climate change, but what you cannot argue about is the fact that it's changing. And the polar ice cap, I mean, anybody can look at the imagery and the pictures and see that it is changing dramatically. And so what that does, the opportunity that comes from that, of course, is the possibility for trade, a shorter route coming from the Pacific over the top to the Atlantic. The Chinese, in fact, the biggest embassy in Iceland is the Chinese embassy. And it's not because they've developed an affection for cod and salmon. It's because they have all kind of research efforts there in Iceland in anticipation of that trade route opening up. At the same time, the Russian Federation has declared that this so-called trade route that would come across the Arctic is passing through their waters, and therefore they've claimed it, and that any ship that they welcome all ships to come through there, but they'll have to follow behind a Russian icebreaker, and they'll have to have a Russian pilot on board the ship. And of course, the United States Navy says they could stick that because those are international waters. So there's going to be some friction like that. The Russians have begun to expand their military installations along the northern part. I would hate like heck to be stationed up there, by the way, but they're putting air defense systems and other capabilities along that to try and assert control. The other part, of course, is that access to mineral resources under the polar ice cap may become easier. Now, it's not going to be easy, but more accessible, perhaps. And so that's why you're starting to see jockeying there. And China, of course, has declared themselves a near Arctic state. That's an interesting stretch. And maybe in Florida, we have so many Canadians that live in Florida. I think Florida should be declared a near Arctic state also.
Absolutely, or a sub-province of Quebec. So, Ben, we've only got about less than 10 minutes, and something that I wonder if you could, as somebody who had a really amazing and admirable career as a military officer, watching the impeachment trial this week, there have been numerous references to the role of the commander-in-chief. And as somebody who spent my whole career as a civilian, it kind of confuses me or downright rubs me the wrong way, since I've got a president. I don't have a commander-in-chief. You were a military officer. You had a commander-in-chief. But, this is something we've talked about before, and I wonder if you could just opine about the role of the military and veterans in democracy, in a free society, and what you think of events recently.
So I've had a copy of the Constitution with me for about the last 20 years, and you can see it's a little bit dog-eared, but the reason I started carrying it is when I worked in Army Congressional Liaison back in 1999. I had taken an oath to the Constitution since I was a cadet, and I had never actually read the full thing, and I didn't really truly appreciate all the stuff that was in it. But yet, I support and defend the Constitution of the United States, like many people listening tonight have done. And I was working with a congressional staffer on an issue, and he was barking at me about how the Army was doing basic training. This was when we were beginning to integrate. So women and men were going to go to basic training together, like what happens there in Fort Jackson. And I asked him, I said, why do you care how the Army does basic training? He said, have you ever read the Constitution there, Colonel? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lays out the responsibilities of the Congress when it comes to the military. And I'm like, what? I said, I know the president's the commander in chief. He said, why don't you read the Constitution? And so I did. And sure enough, I'm sure all of you already know, Article 1 lays out the duties of the Congress, of the legislative branch. Article 2 lays out the duties of the executive. I don't think that was just a simple administrative decision. I think this was by design, if you go back to when this document was first written. In Article 1, Section 8 says the Congress shall, and of course they do all these things, the Congress shall have power to, and you name it. But you get to the military part, it says to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy. That's very interesting right there. To raise armies and provide a navy. You know, our country did not want to have a standing army. Even though the Army was a year older than the Army was formed in 1775, a year before the Declaration. But we are a maritime nation. And so that's why in the Constitution, they said you have to keep a Navy and we'll raise an Army when we need one. And really up until World War II, that's been our tradition. By the way, it says nothing about the Marine Corps or Air Force in here. So I don't know how they get all the money they get.
Or the Space Force.
Or the Space Force, right? But anyway, and it lays out, you know, regulations and Congress is responsible and all that. Article 2, Section 2, it says the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when they're called into actual service. So, you know, the commander-in-chief thing I've heard about forever. The Congress has those responsibilities. And this makes a big difference because, you know, we don't get a penny. The White House doesn't give a penny to the Department of Defense. It all has to be authorized and appropriated by the Congress by design. And so that actually is very comforting because then, you know, when the chief of the staff of the Army or the chief of naval operations or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has to testify, they don't necessarily have to toe the line. Whatever the president says, that's what they have to say, because they took an oath when they were confirmed in that office that they would always give honest reports to the Congress whenever asked. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy. General Shinseki, one of the greatest Army chiefs we ever had, got into really big trouble with Secretary Rumsfeld when he said, absolutely, we don't have enough stuff to do what we're being told to do, which was different from what the Secretary of Defense had said. But this is the nature of our system. I was terrified. That's not the right word. I was very concerned last summer when I thought that there was a possibility that American soldiers were going to be used to quell disturbances in Washington, D.C. And of course, you all know there's a difference between the Army and the National Guard. The National Guard works for the governor until they're federalized. And again, that's by design. Soldiers, nobody wants to be told to use weapons against Americans, fellow citizens. That's not what we're for. But our oath is to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. So there will be time. There are provisions for that. But I mean, the standard to meet is really, really high. And General Milley, our chairman, of course, he ended up in this scene that you all saw out there in uniform when the president walked over from the White House to this church. And General Milley, 2 days later, in a very public way, said that was a huge mistake. Not only should I not have been there, I should have anticipated that this was going to happen. And he allowed himself to be caught up in it. And so I was, while I was concerned by that, I was proud of him for 2 days later. He's been a friend of mine for many years. That 2 days later, he said, hey, I screwed up. I made a huge mistake. I should have never done this, this. And I was pretty sure that was going to be his last day on the job. But unfortunately, he survived it. That's not a situation that you want your military to be in. I am concerned that we have extremists in our ranks, in our formation. Not a lot, but it doesn't take a lot. And there were enough people involved in the assault on the Capitol on 6 January that were reservists or guardsmen or veterans that it's embarrassing and it worries me. And we've got to figure out how do we make sure that the Army, that the Navy, that our military is representative of the entire country. But at the same time, leaders have to be able to look down into their formation. And if you see whether it's gang symbols or extremist organization activity, that's got to be rooted out, just like sexual assault has got to be rooted out. That is no tolerance. Anything that undermines the teamwork and cohesion of the military formation has got to be rooted out. And I think we've got some work to do there. And of course, Secretary Austin has directed a stand down in the Department of Defense so that leaders can address these kind of issues.
Well, from your experience, General, we seem to also have the dynamic of military retirees or former military also being involved in the extremist groups and present in the assault on the Capitol and so on. What in your opinion can be done in those terms for those military exiting the active duty?
Well, that's Dean Johnson. That's a good question because most retired officers, admirals, generals, colonels, are reluctant to get into politics because, in terms of actively supporting or doing things, because of the 30 or 40 years that you had military service where the military was apolitical, you couldn't, it's illegal to be in uniform, for example, to go out with a, to demonstrate you support a particular candidate. So it's in sort of the DNA. I, for the first time in my life, got involved in a campaign, and I did it. I wrote a letter. And by the way, I've been a Republican my whole life. My family, everybody. But for the first time, I could not vote for the Republican candidate because I was so concerned about President Trump's his view of the Constitution when he would talk about my judges and Obama judges and my generals, and they're like, no, sir, I'm not your general or general of the United States Army. So it was a demonstration of an understanding that was just completely at odds with what I believed in and how he viewed the military. And then, of course, the damage I thought he was doing to the alliance, which is a huge part of America's security. So for those reasons, I decided to write a letter to our little newspaper there in Tallahassee, Florida. And I'm sure some of you guys have written letters to the editor before. The most fun, after you sweat and you try to get it right, and you're anticipating that maybe somebody in your family is not going to be happy with it. When you read the responses, I was called a swamp creature several times by my fellow Floridians because I chose to criticize the president's approach to things. But nonetheless, Tim, what I'm saying is most people in the former military are reluctant to get openly involved in it just because of decades of not being involved in it. But what I saw on the 6th of January, people with equipment, and of course now many of the people have been arrested. It turns out that they were in the military. I think our leaders, well, the president, senior civilian leaders, as well as senior retired military, have got to take a stand against this, to say that this is unacceptable and it tarnishes the 99% that do live up to that oath and do conduct themselves in a way that you would expect them to do.
Well, we have reached the end of our time. and I feel like it really went fast. We do have one more question that just appeared on the chat. And if you don't mind me extending, I think I would like to put this in. This is from Morgan Kerner, who is the chair of our very good German department here. And he is asking, what are your thoughts about the rising nationalism and extremism in Europe and in Germany in particular? The concern about extremists in the military has also come up in Germany as well of late. So he would like your insights on that question.
So, herzlichen Dank, Herr Kerner.
Herr Dr. Kerner.
Herr Dr. Entschuldigung. It seems to me that in Germany that there's been a plateau, that the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, has probably reached their maximum potential in terms of the growth. Most of it seems to be in the former East German DDR. And I think part of that is because they still, even though the government of the Federal Republic of Germany has invested hundreds of millions of euro into former East Germany, they're still behind economically. And so that part of the population, I think, is more vulnerable and feels left behind. And so that they're more easily swayed to blame immigrants, for example, for their misfortune. Germany is working hard to get off of coal, and most of the coal mining industry is in former East Germany as well. So again, you've got a decision to, we're getting off nuclear power, we're getting out of coal. Tens of thousands of employees in that part of in Saxony are going to pay the price economically. And so I think that has contributed to some of this. And of course, we know that the Kremlin was pouring money into some of the protests that were happening around Chemnitz, for example, to keep this bubbling and to create instability in Germany, just like they have done in the United States and in other countries, in the UK, in France. The Kremlin does this not because they want a particular side to win, but because they want people to lose confidence in the process and to create as much instability as possible. This is part of the approach. In the military, they did recently, the defense minister, known AKK as Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, she's an impressive woman. She flopped as the head of the CDU. She was the one that Merkel had picked as sort of the successor. That was not her thing, but she is doing a terrific job as the defense minister. I'm very impressed with her. And she and General Zorn, who is the equivalent of the chief of defense, he is the chief of defense for the Bundeswehr. They're rooting this out. And it was in one particular unit in in their special forces that they've gone after it. And I think they will eventually get this solved, but you can't eliminate all of it. But I think inside the military and also a little bit inside the police, there tends to be a higher percentage than you might find in any other sort of segment of society. At the end of the day, rising nationalism, and there's probably some political scientists out there listening tonight that would challenge me on this, but usually nationalism arises because a leader can't solve people's problems with other means. And so they point to external problems and external causes and use nationalism as a way to distract and solidify their power. And I think some of that's happening. President Macron is being challenged now. He's got a very, very narrow lead over Marine Le Pen. Of course, Prime Minister Orban in Hungary has had a very defiant approach, and the EU has not figured out how to, even though Hungary gets as much EU money as anybody, he thumbs his nose there. But I think the United States can help. First of all, we have to live up to our own talking points, set the example, and then support civil society without trying to intentionally undermine regimes of NATO allies.
Well, now that was absolutely an enjoyable evening. And I want to thank some individuals, of course, who've put a lot of good time into this. Bambi Downs, who managed to pull off what I will now refer to as the great shift from Teams to Zoom. Ambassador Melville, Jim, you are always the consummate host. And thank you for all the good discussion tonight. Our friends at the World Affairs Council of Charleston, thank you for your attendance and your continued partnership. Our colleague from the East-West Institute, General Hodges, we want to thank you too for a great presentation and discussion. It was a great way to end with the civil society. We hope that the John Edwin Mroz Global Leadership Institute will give us a good platform for preparing this generation and future generations to have a worldwide impact. Well, please consider joining us for our next Mroz Institute World Affairs Colloquium. Will be coming up soon on Thursday, March 11th at 7 p.m. It will feature Miss Karen Donfried, President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the topic that night will be starting a new course for transatlantic cooperation. So please all, until then, take care of yourselves and remember that what happens here affects what happens there, and what happens there affects what happens here. Thank you very much for your attendance tonight, and thank you again, General Hodges, for your participation. Everybody have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, everyone.